My name is Jennifer Novak-Leonard. I'm a research associate professor in the College of Fine and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I have the privilege of serving as the research director for the college's Arts Impact Initiative, which is hosting today's conversation. I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Pickashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the people of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of the institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. As I noted, the Arts Impact Initiative is a new initiative of the College of Fine and Applied Arts and is hosting today's conversation. The Arts Impact Initiative works to foster understanding of the roles of art and artists in community development and in promoting social well-being to guide both arts practice and policy. The work is advanced through research and in partnering with policymakers, communities, and arts professionals to inform and develop actionable strategies for enhancing the way we work and live our lives. The Arts Initiative is supported by the Investment for Growth program that comes from the university's offices of the Provost and of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation. Along with today's conversation, they also have provided support for an issue brief that is just being released today on the status of artists and creative workers. It's received additional support from the University of Illinois System's presidential initiative, expanding the impact of the arts and of the humanities. We'll be providing a link for that shortly. Now to turn to the focus of our conversation for today. We know the creative sector and its labor force have been among the hardest hit by the pandemic nationally and in Illinois. And we've seen this data collected and evidence coalesced through multiple sources, including from national sources, from Americans for the Arts, and we have a couple links to their resources in the chat for you, as well as from Arts Alliance Illinois. We've included some of their resources in the chat as well. Additionally, research that is coming from the issue brief that we'll be releasing just later on today, using the current population survey, which provides the most recent data on employment and unemployment within the sector, gives us a visual to understand not only the high rates of unemployment that the arts and cultural sector has experienced, but also the length of unemployment of disproportionate rates and sizes compared to other workers within the labor force. This is we've seen improvements generally in the economy from the immediate devastation from the onset of the pandemic, but there are a lot of concerns about that lag in recovery for the arts and creative sector, particularly when compared to other workers, the ongoing precarity in terms of the structure of the labor force, and concerns about the overall shrinkage of the artistic and labor force. So with this background, we turn to what we hope to unpack today. What are the paths forward for immediate recovery, as well as longer-term policy changes to help creative workers and to maintain a creative sector labor force, both nationally and within Illinois? And to help us unpack this large question, we are delighted to have with us today Claire Rice and Julio Rodriguez to discuss more. Julio Rodriguez is Deputy Director of the Office of Employment and Training and has been working in the field of human services for the last 30 plus years at the senior management level, and currently manages many of the Illinois programs related to federal workforce innovation, the Federal Workforce and Innovation Opportunity Act. And these are the opportunities that relate most directly to the creative worker funding. Claire Rice is the Executive Director of Arts Alliance Illinois, a statewide service and advocacy organization that champions arts supportive policies and funding opportunities to benefit all Illinois residents. Under her leadership, the Alliance recently received a nonprofit innovation award for their work managing the $8 million Arts for Illinois Relief Fund, which is a public-private partnership between the state of Illinois, City of Chicago, private philanthropy, and grassroots donors supporting the arts community in response to COVID-19. In our time together today, first we'll hear directly from Julio and Claire, and then we'll be joined by Andrew Greenlee, who's an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning and an Art Impact Initiative collaborator, for a moderated conversation with Claire and Julio. We invite everyone in the audience to submit questions and pose your thoughts through the chat box, and we will get to as many of these questions and weave in your comments as time allows throughout our time together today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Claire and to Julio.
Thanks, Jennifer. I know my colleague Julio is having a little bit of Zoom trouble, but he will be joining me shortly, and I'm happy to start talking about our collaboration, and then he will join when he is able. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm really thrilled to be in partnership with the University of Illinois, and it's not just this exciting research collaboration, but to more broadly address some critical issues facing the arts and cultural sector as we're still clawing our way out of this pandemic. It's been an extraordinarily challenging time.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Hi, Julio. Welcome via phone, if nothing else. So we're just kicking things off.
Okay, great.
And let me know if you can see the screen and if you need any help navigating that piece.
I will. Can't actually see the screen.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, you got the slides. We'll tag team this with aplomb. So I was just saying that as we all know, it's been an extraordinarily challenging time for the arts, and frankly, it's been a really exciting time to think about ways we can come back to this work differently, particularly when it comes to our creative workforce in Illinois. And Julio and I had actually gotten to know one another through mutual friends and in the sector. He's got a very clear interest in this work and a passion for this work in terms of supporting the creative workforce, but it's not something that traditional workforce development systems have generally done. And so it's been really exciting to think with Julio about how we use the challenged and frankly broken systems that we have within workforce development to support the creative workforce as they stand now, and then also think about how we might reinvent those systems for the future. So I'll kick it off with that first slide. Carolyn, thank you. We'll talk a little bit about the multiple approaches that we're using. This is just a great quote from UNESCO. I think that we're thinking about not just the jobs of today, both within and outside the creative economy, but really the jobs of tomorrow. And we want to think about a different approach to workforce development when it comes to the creative economy. And we'll talk a little bit with the next slide about the various approaches that the Arts Alliance is taking as a service and advocacy organization to engaging that creative workforce across the state. So Julio and I will just kind of go back and forth on these. I'll give an overview and then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into each of these strategies. So the first one's really about workforce development within the creative industries, and Julio can give you a better general sense of what we mean when we say workforce development. But within this strategy, we're really thinking about rebuilding the creative economy and centering it as an essential piece of our recovery and future growth in Illinois, particularly with a lens of equity and access, thinking about apprenticeship, content creation, film as a growth industry in the moment, even particularly during the pandemic when a lot of the other disciplines within our sector were shut down or not operating fully. And I think there's a lot we can do really within the creative economy itself to build out and support our workforce. Of course, in the last 2 years, in terms of this responsiveness pillar, we've thought a lot about short-term hires in kind of, I'll think of sort of bridge projects, sort of bridging from the before times through the pandemic, but using those opportunities as a way to position artists as problem solvers, creatives as problem solvers, and kind of reposition them in civic and social spaces in new ways. And we'll talk a little bit about a project we worked on around vaccine adoption. And then really excited about the Illinois Creative Workforce Activation Project Julie and I are working on together, which is really about opening up opportunities for creative workers. We all know that a lot of our creative workers are not gaining a significant portion of their income from their creative work. It's a small portion of their income, and then they're supplementing either with multiple gigs or with a 9-to-5 job. And so Julie and I are thinking, what does it look like to either replace those multiple gigs or that 9-to-5 job with something that's more aligned and cohesive with their creative practice? What would that mean if we really embed and integrate artists and creatives into other sectors as artists and creatives, not just as workers who are artists and creatives on the side? So we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there. And then this idea of stabilization for our creative workforce and really supporting the gig economy with some social safety net programs that we're certainly working on with the Arts Alliance. So I'll turn it over to Julio to talk a little bit about this idea of workforce investment with the next slide, and what it might look like to kind of invest within the creative workforce here in Illinois.
Great. Thanks, Claire. I really appreciate that. Sorry you all can't see me, but know that I'm smiling and excited about this opportunity to just have this conversation and what I think it allows us to do going forward. Couple things that to give you a little bit of an idea of what the current sort of workforce landscape looks like sort of in the creative space. One thing that the state has been doing over probably the last 20 years that I've been working at the Department of Commerce is really looking at the film industry and finding ways to really stand it up and really make it one of the key components of our economy. And they've done that initially with sort of tax credits that some of you may or may not be aware of, but that incentive has really been a real engine for really bringing more and more opportunities here in Illinois for films and sort of related activities. And but recently, probably within the last 5 years, one of the things that has come up time and time again is sort of the need not only to create a pipeline for the film industry, but also to think about the idea of equity and diversity and how do we help take this really strong and thriving sort of industry and start to build a pipeline. So, and just recently, this was actually instituted was this sort of workforce training program specifically tied to the film industry. There is hope that as we continue to explore that we will look at other sectors within the creative industries to do similar types of training. And one way that we think that we can do that and also meet the sort of equity goal is really looking at expanding apprenticeship programs and pre-apprenticeship programs within the creative space. And the reason apprenticeship programs are particularly important is because they're a learn and earn model. To enter an apprenticeship program, one of the things that an employer agrees to is to actually hire that person and pay wages as this person is actually developing the skills they need to be proficient in their particular occupation within that sector. Apprenticeships, interestingly enough, even though as the economy has really struggled, we have seen more and more employers across many industries actually begin to develop apprenticeship programs. And we're very excited that it was one of the areas we thought was going to drop off because of the pandemic. And we've actually seen greater investments on the part of businesses to start apprenticeship programs, and with younger folks to start pre-apprenticeship programs in high schools to begin to think about ways to get young people engaged in sectors that they oftentimes don't think about. The other thing that's important about apprenticeships is that the state also has a tax incentive there. So for every apprentice that a company starts or that employs, they get a $3,500 credit. If the individual that they apprentice is also from an underserved community. Let's say in the case of IT, women who are not as visible within that industry, they get an additional $1,500 in a tax credit that they can use to offset their costs related to developing an apprenticeship program. So that's a $5,000 tax incentive for businesses that start apprenticeship programs. So we really see there's a great opportunity to continue to expand that, and in particular in the creative space. The other thing is that we're really, and Claire and I have really been working on, is trying to really develop these crosswalks, these sort of career pathways that we think really start with what are the key sort of skill sets that folks in the creative arts start with, and how do we crosswalk some of those to some of the opportunities that exist within other sectors, such as IT and healthcare and others that I'll talk about later. But the real idea is to really start to think about not only how do we build a pipeline into the creative arts, but also how do we expand the creative arts so it incorporates other sectors and allows people to utilize their skill sets in a variety of different settings. One example that I would give is oftentimes people don't realize how much the building trades are connected to the creative arts. But if you're somebody who builds sets, if you're somebody who's involved with a lot of the behind the scenes work, you will find that many of those folks who do that work are in the building trades, and oftentimes have started as apprentices in either as electricians or in other types of sort of technical skills. And then the other thing that we're really trying to do is think about what are types of certifications and credentialing that we can offer that's short term, that can really expedite people's ability to build skills and credentials either through our community colleges or higher education, or through other programs in the private sector that could augment the skills that they have and provide them credentials as well. Now I'll turn it back to Claire.
Thanks, Julio. So the really exciting opportunities within the creative ecosystem that Julio just touched on. You know, what we're seeing a lot of around the country, and we certainly stuck our toe in the water as well, is more of these short-term interventions. And this is, I really think, when people are like, you know, the new WPA, you hear a lot of talk about that, right? And have over the last couple of years. A lot of that stuff is really exciting and wonderful, but not necessarily sustainable in its application. And I'd say it's probably the most commonly seen intervention. And we can talk about some examples from other states that I've mentioned here in terms of artists combating social isolation or engaging with transportation departments, all really great stuff. And we went ahead and wanted to really demonstrate some of the ways artists can support some of these other areas, and have actually been able to start with a mostly private grant, some modest public support for a campaign we call Vax to Get Back. And with the success of the initial grant and the initial pilot program, have been able to continue that with additional grants for artists to really deploy vaccine positive messaging. So we'll just play a video. It's 1 minute of a highlight, kind of sizzle reel of some of those projects that hopefully will come through for you all without too much delay. Oh, I think that, Carolyn, you'll need to do the audio. The audio is not coming through. So when you share your screen, I think you have to share it with audio. There you go. Thank you. So that's really, a workforce intervention as well, but as hopefully a shorter term one, although the need for vaccine adoption continues, and we are, as I said, working on, based on the success of the first iteration of that project, are now expanding that with a grant directly from the CDC Foundation to expand that work into vaccine or zip codes with lower vaccine adoption around the state. So really, really exciting work there. And again, for us as an advocacy organization, also continues to help position artists in multiple facets of society and civic life in important ways. And I'll turn it back to Julio to talk a little bit about on the next slide, Carolyn, the Illinois Creative Workforce Activation Project that, no, actually one back, please, that we're, working on, which is really about thinking about it. Julio, this is the slide that's got the skills that creatives possess and the overlapping skills that growth industries within Illinois need.
So, as Claire was saying, I think one of the things that we're really attempting to do is to really do this crosswalk that sometimes I think both employers in some of these key industries, as well as folks in the creative arts, sometimes don't realize is that there really is a natural bridge between the needs that employers have around certain skill sets and what folks in the creative arts possess. I know many of my friends in the creative arts are sort of, they possess a lot of skills that they oftentimes utilize within their creative work, and then sometimes they underutilize them in jobs that they take that are sort of temporary and become sort of just ways for them to supplement their income. But oftentimes what really doesn't happen is there's not a real sort of integration and a way for folks to really think about how do I take those skill sets, those transferable skills, and how do I create an opportunity within a sector that actually can support my creative work as well. In my college years, I had many, many friends who were dancers, actors, film producers, all who worked in the restaurant industry. And what were the skills that they were able to really utilize within that industry? It really was their service orientation, their ability to actually problem solve. So if you've ever waited tables, you know that it's a constant problem solving environment, but also using emotional intelligence, being able to read your customers, really understand what it is that they're looking for. And while in a restaurant setting, that was certainly something that where you could utilize them, it wasn't as intentional or deliberate. Whereas now you see more and more industries, these sort of 5 skill sets have become sort of integral regardless of what occupation and where you sit within that environment or workplace. And I think what we're really trying to do is to really think about how do we take this sort of these mutual needs and ways to really complement what employers and what creatives need to stabilize their ability to do their creative work and bring them under one umbrella. And one way that we're trying to do that is to really think about what are the key occupations within these sort of high growth industries where creators would have a natural fit and still allow for them to be able to have some flexibility and ability to work on their creative work at the same time, or when they're not in need of having to do this other work on a consistent basis. So where do we find those opportunities? So one of the things that we're really trying to do is one is sort of, go out and meet with folks in the creative section, really think about how does this sort of align with them and with what they're thinking. The other group that we're trying to talk to is major employers who we can create as champions around this work. And then I should tell you that the other thing that we've done within our department is that we're starting to incentivize through our workforce dollars, the relationship building between the creative arts and key growth industries. So one of the things that we're embedding in a lot of our notice of funding opportunities is asking providers to really reach out to folks in the creative arts and really think about the kinds of trainings and kinds of opportunities that they can provide through their programs that really help create that bridge to these high growth industries while recognizing the importance of allowing creatives to continue to do the work that they love, and that's where their primary interests lie. So with that said, we'll open up, I'm sure, to questions. But I think as I turn it over to Claire, part of it is also building an ecosystem within Illinois that really not just thinks about workforce, but also thinks about what are the kinds of supports that creative folks need within their current sector, but also as they move to other sectors or integrate into other sectors. How do we stabilize them as workers so that the next time there is some type of sort of economic crisis, they can better buffer it or weather it because they're able to have more flexibility in how they use their skill sets. So I'll turn it over to Claire now.
Yeah, I'm going to close our formal remarks and turn to conversation with Andrew. But lastly, and we'll touch on this last slide here, Carolyn, if we go to the next one, this need for stabilization, as Julio just mentioned, extremely important, even before the pandemic, far greater insecurity, both from an employment standpoint and financial standpoint for our sector than many other workers. So you see some of the challenges that creatives face outlined here. And so we're thinking about, particularly at the Arts Alliance and in collaboration with some of the workforce working groups at DCEO, where Julio is, as well as some of the governor's working groups on the future of work. What does it look like to support our gig economy better? And what is it that we need to advocate for? And I'll say mostly in collaboration with other sectors with large chunks of gig workers, right? It doesn't make sense for us to do this on our own in arts and culture when gig workers and the needs of gig workers are not, narrowly exclusive to the creative sector, but really regardless of whether you're working, what part of the gig economy you're working in, you're still going to need healthcare, you're still going to need housing support, you're still going to need a lot of the social safety net that is critical for your stability as an individual worker outside of the context of a full-time employment job. So I think lots to talk about there too, including, my friend Paul asked about guaranteed income programs, and happy to talk about those as well and what we've seen across the country and what we're thinking about here in Illinois. But yeah, would love to move into broader conversation with Andrew and with the group.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for allowing me to join the conversation here. I do just want to draw people's attention quickly to the chat, where we've been posting both resources, reports, links to websites and other things that will be useful for you all. And also to encourage you, as we're entering into this conversational period, to enter questions in the chat. And both Jennifer and I will do our best to intersperse those into the conversation as we go along. So thanks to those of you who have already started doing that, and please continue to do so as we continue talking. So to open us up and get us into conversation, I'd like us to think about how we situate what's been going on in Illinois within the bigger picture. And basically the first question that comes to my mind as a policy researcher is, well, how does what's happening in Illinois compare to what's been happening throughout the country? Certainly in our report, we see distinct impacts on artists in Illinois, but I think it's useful for us to get a sense from your perspectives, both in advocacy and also in state government, how Illinois compares. What are the ways in which we kind of share have a shared plight with other places, and how are some things also perhaps different for us here in Illinois?
I can start, and then I know Julio will chime in as well. I mean, I think obviously the earned revenue challenges, both for individual creative workers and for cultural organizations, are shared across the state here and then across the country. So that's not unique to this state. We just recently did yet another COVID impact survey to try and estimate the impact of the Omicron variant on our sector. And even in 2021, with the reopening, with many folks continuing to pursue moving forward with events, exhibitions, performances, etc., folks are still seeing along the lines of 31% earned revenue loss organizationally, and then even more than that from an individual income standpoint. So we're still, and then from a projection standpoint, we asked folks to look forward for 6 months of 2022, and they're on pace because of cancellations, postponements, et cetera, to match that as well. So we're really, as bullish as the governor's budget address was this week, we're just not seeing that type of recovery yet in our sector. Thankfully, the federal government has stepped up with significant grants and support and relief. That is also shared. We've certainly received a good chunk of change from the federal government, and that's meant a lot to many of our cultural organizations. And some of that has been able to be passed through to individuals as well in the form of cash relief. But, I think the places where we're unique, I do think this partnership that Julio and I have, we've been asked to talk about it, not just here, but nationally. And folks are really trying, this relationship between the State Arts Advocacy Organization and the workforce leader in state government is unique, right? This does not happen across the country. This is something that I think is partly just about who Julio is as a person and what he cares about, but also that what he sees as an opportunity and a growth sector for our state. So I think the types of things we're trying, like I said, we're seeing a lot of those short-term interventions all over the place, right? Like artists doing mural stuff, artists doing pop-up performance stuff, and getting government, the new part of that is government funding going to support those types of interventions that we haven't seen that scale of in the past. That's happening all over the country. But I think this type of work towards sustainable solutions and particularly in non-creative sectors, placing creative workers in other sectors where they're already working, where they're already making a difference, but making them visible and seen and kind of cared for in those spaces. That idea, I think, is quite unique. And I think a place where we maybe have to catch up a little bit is in some of these worker protection conversations. As Paul Castle mentioned in the chat, there have been some guaranteed income programs that other states and cities have tried, one in Minneapolis, St. Paul for artists and creative workers, one out in San Francisco. I'm actually less interested in those programs segmenting arts and cultural workers out as, kind of special snowflakes that need cash support. If we're going to talk about guaranteed income programs, artists just need to be included as workers, as professionals, alongside other workers who are being protected through programs such as guaranteed income. So I'm very interested in talking about that, but not as kind of a artist specific or creative specific policy intervention. And I'm sure Julio has lots to say on that too.
Yeah, I think, well, let me just start with the comparison piece. So in terms of Illinois, how we compare with sort of our counterparts across the country. One thing that is really important to know about Illinois in general is we are, and the Midwest in general, usually takes longer to recover regardless of sort of the circumstances. That has just been a historical trend that, the recovery always starts in the coast and then works its way to the middle. What I think we've seen with the pandemic that has been probably one of the things that has been the most revealing is that, Illinois in particular has always seen itself as our strength has been our diversity. And by diversity, I mean the types of industries that we have in Illinois has been able to weather a lot of economic challenges in the past. Unfortunately, this time our diversity, because of just the types of sectors that are represented, personal services, healthcare, manufacturing, we were hit especially hard, where our numbers were really, because of the diversity of our industries, we just saw greater and greater sort of retraction as the pandemic kind of took hold. Prior to pandemic, the hospitality industry, restaurant industry were thriving in ways that, were making the state, one of the best tourist destinations actually in the world. Illinois was ranked one of the top 10 states in numerous categories as a result of our sort of hospitality and service industries. And obviously, those impacts then spilled over to sort of the creatives, not only in terms of jobs, but also, so much of hospitality and the service industries link up in many ways to the sort of creative arts and entertainment, in that they kind of go hand in hand and in terms of quality of life in a community. So that's where Illinois we kind of got two gut punches, if you will. On the positive side, what is also kind of unique about Illinois is that many in our state folks are able to pivot and find ways to kind of work through some of these challenges. Though that pivot is still evolving, we are seeing opportunities in many places and in many sectors starting to kind of take hold. But the other thing that's not unique to Illinois, but is a very important thing to keep in mind in terms of the Midwest, is that we probably have the largest aging population. So the other challenge that we have is that we need to be able to attract more people to Illinois who are younger. We need to keep the people who are young here in Illinois here. And one way that we do that is actually through expanding opportunities within the creative arts. And so I think that is one area that at least in film that we've seen, is that the more our film industry grew, the more we were continuing to then hold on to our talent that we grew here and be able to attract new talent. And so that's kind of one of the things that I think is really important, is to sort of think about how does sort of the creative sector really become an economic engine. And to that end, I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic that was really, a head turner was when the U.S. Chamber championed actually the creative sector around unemployment insurance, as well as making sure that the federal government was investing huge amounts of money into the creative sector. Because I think for the first time, industry saw the creative sector as a vital part of the economic package of many states. So I think those are very positive signs going forward, in that this is a time to harness sort of industry champions to your corner in terms of looking at what kinds of policy changes need to continue to stay in place as we move out of the pandemic. Things like making sure that folks in the creative arts are eligible for unemployment insurance, and that we don't have the catch up that we had to do during the early part of the pandemic and all of the missteps. And again, to Claire's point, where we're not creating boutique programs, but we're really seeing folks in the creative arts as workers and not as these sort of folks on the sideline and these institutions that help workers as not being relevant to them. I think we really have to do a lot of work around making sure that all of the systems that support workers should be supporting workers in the creative arts, and that to not be seduced with the idea of getting your own kind of set-aside program, because then oftentimes what happens with those types of programs is they disappear, or there's really no adequate funding provided to really sustain them in any significant way. The other thing that I would say is something for us to really think about as we do this work is what is the role of entrepreneurship and small business? I think that's another area that we don't often think about when it comes to creatives and what we should be providing in the sort of economic development space as it relates to self-employment, to entrepreneurship and small businesses. And I think that's another realm of resources that should come to bear on this sector that oftentimes people don't even make the connection because they don't think of this sector neither as businesses or as workers, but this sort of intangible group of people that are doing work, but nobody's really clearly seen how they fit within the larger landscape. So I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much for your comments and reflections. And you touched on what I'd like to ask about next in terms of differential recovery needs. You've spoken a bit about particular segments of the labor force, be that through self-employment, specific medium, the possibilities for film, but you also spoke earlier about, in your comments around some pipeline programs, the focus on diversity in terms of demographic representation and identity. I wonder if you could just reflect and share some additional comments you may have about differential recovery needs. How are different segments, be that where people are working, how they are working, or their own identity, what are differential needs for recovery?
So I think one of the things that really has become really evident to us is that women in the workforce, especially as it relates to childcare, we have to really begin to have real serious conversations about that as a benefit that should be offered as part of the workplace package. Because women have been differentially impacted by both the pandemic and the economic turndown, in particular women with children, whether single or in families. The issue of childcare has really risen up as one of those factors that we've talked about as a support, but really have not made real long-term investments, both on the public or private side. I think the other thing that is unfortunate but true is that while the unemployment rate among the general population has gone down to about 3.9 nationally, the unemployment rate among African Americans is at 7.2, and among youth in double-digit numbers. And that pre-pandemic and now continue to be real serious concerns that we still see systemic racism as one of the biggest barriers to really engaging that community into opportunities within a variety of different sectors. But I think there's also a real important sort of factor there around looking at how do we support not only individuals, but the communities they live in. So there's a quality of life, both at the workplace and at home, that really creates an ecosystem so that individual thrives. And in particular, African American and Latino communities have really suffered because their communities have been disinvested in multiple ways, and we need to solve that as we think about how people are impacted and the very specific things that have happened to them. And then one other population that I would call out is people with disabilities who has been also very, very adversely impacted by the recent situation with COVID, not only because of their risks have really grown exponentially in terms of workplace, but also opportunities have dwindled as a result of the pandemic. I hope that answered your question. And then I certainly have Claire offer some thoughts.
I don't have much to add. I will say we've seen, some distinctions in terms of recovery around artistic disciplines, right? Folks that are smaller, more nimble are able to reopen faster, but have also not had the financial incentive to reopen as quickly. So it's been a real catch-22 around whether they've been able to recover or come back. I think also distinction, but so there's a size issue there in terms of organizations. I think with disciplines, performing artists have been clearly more consistently adversely impacted, the data has shown us, than visual artists who've still been able to sell work, make work, have been less reliant on large gatherings of people. And then I will say that we've seen some data coming out of Giving USA that, at least on the organizational front, there have been some corrections in, historic divestment in BIPOC-led and serving organizations. So we're actually seeing, even though arts funding as a whole has decreased over the last couple of years, investment in BIPOC-led and serving organizations has increased. So we haven't seen the data yet on impact on individuals, but we're hoping that also means slightly greater levels of investment in individual BIPOC creatives as well.
Indeed. Thank you for that. I think for me, a lot of what I'm hearing brings up a broader question. We spend a lot of time talking about what's going on at the state level, how we might kind of compare it to the nation, and some of these also disparities that are kind of run through this broader conversation. It's really intriguing, some of the conversation that we've had and some of the insight that you shared around emerging conversations around thinking a bit differently about workforce development, thinking about how we envision both a new social safety net and then also new ways of envisioning artists and creative workers engaging in economic activity. I'm curious how some of this conversation at the state level filters down into some of the insights or exciting things that you're seeing happening at either the regional or the local level. What are we seeing happening within local communities as they're navigating and finding their way through the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think you all know this as well, just being in said local communities right around the state. I think, the innovation we've seen is extraordinary and happens on that hyper local level. I think the types of interventions and innovation we've seen is most powerful at the local level, both I think from in some ways from both a policy landscape and a programmatic landscape when it comes to the pickup truck that would drive down my street with the string quartet on the back during the stay-at-home orders. So I think, but everything from that to then what does it look like to support artists at the hyperlocal level? I mean, we've we helped develop the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund. I do think cash relief programs have come into their own in the last 2 years. I would say obviously more at the local levels. Arts for Illinois was statewide in its scope, but I think it has continued in more local iterations, and we were able to develop an interesting partnership through that program with all of the community foundations, or a select number of community foundations around the state, to do some more individual relief work there. So I think ideas that have had genesis at maybe the state level have then had local permutations and evolutions as well, which has been exciting.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. Yeah, I think that's kind of part of what I think Claire and our goal is to kind of try to see what's happening locally and regionally, and try to figure out how to then at the state level, how can we build some infrastructure around that and help really develop it and firm that up so that it has more a sustained effort rather than sort of a reactionary kind of thing.
Absolutely. Just as a quick follow-up here, I want to kind of synthesize in both Paul and Rose's questions. Paul had asked around examples of local communities perhaps taking up experimental universal basic income approaches, and then Rose talks about what I would say are innovative partnerships and dialogues between advocates, trade organizations and unions, and the state. And so I'm curious if you would just like to point us in that direction and think about what we're seeing in terms of innovation, in terms of institutional partnerships and experiments in the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thrilled to see what this moment has encouraged and forced us to do. My colleague, Eric Deshawn-Doris, is on the line, who's our director of community organizing. And we've put together a coalition, of course, around a particular advocacy ask in this moment that is around some sizable relief dollars, but that is unique in its composition. I mean, this group of essentially service organizations, intermediaries, and we're bringing labor into that too, has never worked together at this scale before. And I have to say that's one of the things that the pandemic highlighted for us, I think, in the creative sector, is some of the gaping holes in that infrastructure when it comes to advocacy and kind of big tent building. We had a lot of folks going to Washington in a not coordinated way, and we sort of fumbled our way through coordination and some infighting and some healthy dialogue to get to some really exciting relief programs. But I do think it behooves us, particularly at the state and local level, to build those alliances before we need them. And so that's what, I mean, it's kind of forced us to do that and do this kind of, let's work across the creative sector. Let's work with tourism and with our CVBs and with our chambers. And so that we're not, at odds with one another as we're putting forth these critical advocacy asks. So that leadership and coalition building work has been invaluable to us, and something we should have done, years ago, but have put it into play.
The only thing I would add to that is really thinking about, when you think locally, when you think about your economic development partners, like your chambers, like your economic development corporations, bringing those folks into these conversations, I think, is really important, as well as looking at, other agencies within. I mean, this is kind of a unique partnership, my agency with, Claire's, I think, oftentimes people think of commerce and don't have a really good sense of what that means. And when I tell people we have the film office, the tourism office, workforce, economic development, people are sort of confused by it. But when you think about all of those things, they really are about creating not only revenues for the state, but also being able to create opportunities for people to really work in unique types of industries. And I think, the creative sector is one of those sort of spaces where we have not, in terms of the economic development community, have really fully understood or really maximized. And I think that's even true within the labor movement, in that, again, they have not really thought about this industry in the way that I think could be a real opportunity, in terms of, particularly when we think about quality jobs and sustained employment and the kinds of supports that are needed. I think there's opportunities to really reimagine, if you will, not only how the creative sector fits within the economic development framework, but then how does the creative workforce lift up some of the inequities and imbalances that are within the workplace.
Indeed. Thank you both for that. As we're ending the end of our time here together, one last question that I think kind of hopefully helps us to think about how we might all engage and advocate around this. I really appreciate, again, the conversation around emerging vision for major and structural change. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts as a closing about what ways might be for all of us in today's conversation to best advocate or to affect these desired forms of change in Illinois and nationally. How should we be involved and engaged in this current moment?
So Claire, can I go first?
Please, Julio.
And you'll bring it home. So there's a couple of things. One, it really is important to find champions within the General Assembly. And really, this is the right time. Our General Assembly has not been always as prolific at thinking about changing the landscape of policy and state laws as they are today. And I think this is a great opportunity because there's new leadership, there's new people who are coming with new ideas and who've been impacted personally by your field, and so it's really important to find the champions within the General Assembly and use those levers. And then on sort of a larger sort of national front, a number of major legislation will be reauthorized. One of those is the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, which is where most of the funding that I have is guided. This is a really important time to think about not only influencing how people in the creative arts can take advantage of the resources and training opportunities that program offers, but also about creating greater dialogue about what are the kinds of supports that your industry needs from the workforce system, and how can that get embedded within that legislation to really make a difference. And then lastly is really around the unemployment insurance and really thinking about how do you create a much better and more sustained effort within that system. And I think those are the three sort of areas that I would look towards.
That's all right on, Julio. And one of the easy ways to do that is to get involved with your local or statewide arts advocacy organization, such as Arts Alliance Illinois. So please do go to and sign up for our newsletter and stay involved and engaged with us. So, but I think there are also direct relationships that you can develop with your legislators, with what's important to you. And we just try and make that easier. So please be a part of that with us, engage with these conversations. And yeah, disagree with us, Paul, if if you like. I think we're going to have a policy agenda setting process over the summer to, as we hopefully make our way out of relief funding conversations into future looking conversations about what we need to champion and fight for at the Arts Alliance. We'd welcome your spirited dialogue about those issues and how we move support for our creative workers forward.
We are at time, and I want to say thank you so very much to Claire and to Julio for your generosity and conversation and thought. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your moderation. And I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Kaylin Randolph-Cato, who's been making magic behind the Zoom screen happen. Also, thank you to everyone for joining us for the conversation. The recording will be available within the next few days on the Arts Impact website. The link is in the chat. We've also put out an issue brief that looks at some of the most current unemployment data, stats on mixed earners that was referenced earlier about multiple job holders. So I would encourage you to check that out there. And a link to sign up for Arts Alliance Illinois newsletters is also in the chat. So thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. Take care.